The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I pressed my face against the cold window of the rehabilitation center, watching my daughter's silver Mercedes disappear around the corner. 3 months. That's how long Dr. Martinez said I'd need to relearn how to walk properly, how to speak without the slight slur that still caught on certain words, how to write my own name without my hand trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. 3 months felt like a lifetime when you're staring at institutional beige walls and listening to the shuffle of walkers down linoleum hallways. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what crushed me wasn't the sterile smell of disinfectant or the way my left leg still dragged slightly when I tried to hurry. It wasn't even the way words sometimes got tangled up in my mouth like Christmas lights you can't untangle. What crushed me was watching my own flesh and blood drive away without so much as a backward glance, leaving me here like I was nothing more than an inconvenience they'd finally found a place to store. "She'll visit," I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the glass. "Rebecca will come back tomorrow, or maybe Sunday. She's just busy with the kids." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. The way Rebecca had signed those admission papers, the brisk efficiency with which she'd unpacked my single suitcase, the way she'd avoided meeting my eyes when she said goodbye, it all pointed to one terrible truth. I wasn't going home in 3 months. I wasn't going home at all. The stroke came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my prized roses in the backyard of the Victorian house I'd called home for 37 years. One moment I was admiring the deep crimson blooms of my favorite bush, the Princess Anne variety that had taken me 3 years to coax into such magnificent glory. And the next moment, the world tilted sideways, like someone had picked up my life and shaken it like a snow globe. I remember the sensation of falling, the way the garden hose slipped from my fingers and began spraying water across the carefully tended flower beds I'd spent decades cultivating. I remember thinking quite clearly that the roses would be fine, that the automatic sprinkler system would take care of them until I could get back up and turn off the hose. Such a strange thing to worry about when your brain is essentially short-circuiting, but that's exactly where my mind went. To the flowers, to the responsibility I felt to keep them alive and thriving. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes later. I know this because Rebecca told me afterward, her voice clinical and detached as she recounted the timeline like she was giving a presentation at the accounting firm where she worked. 17 minutes of lying on wet grass, my mouth forming words that wouldn't come out right, my left side feeling like it belonged to someone else entirely. 17 minutes of staring up at the sky I'd admired from that same garden for decades, now seeing it from an angle that made everything look foreign and frightening. My name is Carol Ann Wilson, though everyone who's ever mattered to me has simply called me Carol. I'm 71 years old, though until 3 months ago I would have sworn I didn't look a day over 60. I've been a widow for 8 years, ever since my husband Robert passed from a heart attack that came swift and merciless on a spring morning, much like the one when my own body betrayed me. Robert and I had planned to travel together in retirement, to see the places we'd always talked about during those late-night conversations when we were too young to believe we'd ever actually be old enough to have the time and money to wander. Instead, I spent my retirement years alone in our beautiful house, tending to my gardens, volunteering at the local library, and watching my daughter Rebecca build a life that seemed to have less and less room for her mother with each passing year. I told myself it was natural, that children were supposed to create their own families and their own traditions. I convinced myself that the increasingly brief phone calls and hurried holiday visits were just signs of a busy, successful life, not evidence that I was slowly being edited out of the story of my own family. Rebecca arrived at the hospital within an hour of my stroke, her perfectly styled blonde hair still neat despite what must have been a frantic drive from her suburban home 40 minutes away. She brought her husband David with her, a man I'd never quite warmed to despite 8 years of family dinners and birthday celebrations. David worked in real estate, made good money, and had the kind of confident smile that never quite reached his eyes when he looked at me. He called me Mrs. Wilson instead of Carol or Mom, and he always seemed to be checking his phone during family gatherings, as if something more important might be happening somewhere else. "How is she?" Rebecca asked the doctor, and I noticed that she directed the question to Dr. Kim instead of to me, even though I was lying right there in the hospital bed, very much conscious and able to speak for myself, albeit with some difficulty. "Your mother has had what we call an ischemic stroke," Dr. Kim explained, her voice gentle but professional. "A blood clot blocked an artery in her brain, causing damage to the surrounding tissue. The good news is that we caught it relatively quickly and she's responding well to treatment. However, she'll need extensive rehabilitation to regain full function." I watched Rebecca's face carefully as the doctor spoke, looking for signs of relief or concern or even simple human emotion. What I saw instead was calculation. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she processed what this meant for her own life, her own schedule, her own carefully ordered world. "How long will the rehabilitation take?" David asked, his tone suggesting this was a business meeting rather than a family crisis. "Several months, possibly longer. She'll need physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy. Many patients benefit from an intensive rehabilitation program in a specialized facility." And there it was, the moment when my fate was decided without anyone actually asking what I wanted. Rebecca and David exchanged one of those married couple looks, the kind that communicates entire conversations without words. I tried to interject, to tell them that I wanted to go home, that I could recover just as well in my own house with the help of visiting therapists. But the words came out slurred and jumbled, and I saw the way they both looked at me with something that might have been pity, but felt more like embarrassment. The rehabilitation center they chose was called Sunset Manor, which struck me as an ironic name for a place where people went to relearn how to live rather than to prepare for dying. It was a sprawling single-story complex surrounded by generic landscaping, the kind of place that looked pleasant enough from the outside but felt institutional the moment you walked through the sliding glass doors. Everything was designed for efficiency rather than comfort, with wide hallways that could accommodate wheelchairs and walkers, grab bars on every wall, and that particular shade of blue-green paint that someone had probably decided was calming, but mostly just made me think of hospital gowns. My room was small but private, which I supposed was a luxury of sorts. It had a single bed with rails that could be raised and lowered, a nightstand, a dresser, and a chair positioned by the window that looked out onto a courtyard where other residents sometimes sat in wheelchairs, staring at nothing in particular. The walls were bare except for a generic landscape painting that showed mountains and a lake, the kind of artwork you might find in a budget hotel room. Rebecca unpacked my belongings with the same efficiency she brought to everything else in her life. She hung my clothes in the narrow closet, arranged my toiletries on the bathroom counter, and placed a few framed photographs on the nightstand. One showed Robert and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and impossibly naive about what the future would bring. Another was a picture of Rebecca at her college graduation, her arm around my waist as we both smiled for the camera. The third was a photo of my grandchildren, Rebecca's twins Emma and Jacob, taken at last year's Christmas gathering when they were still young enough to hug their grandmother without being prompted by their parents. "I think this will be good for you, Mom," Rebecca said as she folded the empty suitcase and placed it in the closet. "You'll get the specialized care you need, and you won't have to worry about maintaining that big house while you're recovering." I wanted to tell her that I loved that house, that it was filled with memories of her father and her childhood, that the roses I'd been watering when I collapsed had been planted to celebrate her birth. I wanted to explain that being away from home didn't feel like relief, it felt like exile. But my words were still unreliable, and Rebecca seemed to interpret my silence as agreement. "We'll visit as often as we can," she continued, though she didn't meet my eyes as she said it. "And I'll make sure the house is taken care of while you're here. David knows a good property management company. David was standing in the doorway, checking his phone again, and I wondered if he was already mentally calculating what my house might be worth on the current market. The thought made my stomach clench, but I pushed it away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca would never sell my home without asking me. She was my daughter, my only child. The little girl I'd rocked to sleep and helped with homework and driven to soccer practice and college orientation. Surely the bond between us was stronger than whatever practical considerations were running through her mind as she looked at me lying there with my crooked smile and halting speech. The first week at Sunset Manor passed in a blur of assessments and therapy sessions and medications that made me feel like I was moving through thick fog. I met with Dr. Martinez, a kind woman with graying hair who explained my rehabilitation plan with patience and optimism. I worked with Sarah, a physical therapist who couldn't have been much older than Rebecca, but who had a way of making the exhausting work of relearning to walk feel like an achievable goal rather than an impossible mountain to climb. I saw Linda, a speech therapist who helped me practice forming words clearly and who never made me feel stupid when I stumbled over syllables that used to flow as naturally as breathing. The other residents were a mix of stroke survivors, people recovering from hip surgeries, and individuals dealing with various forms of dementia. There was Margaret, a former teacher who had suffered a stroke 6 months before mine and who could now walk with only a cane and speak almost normally. She became my unofficial guide to life at Sunset Manor, explaining which physical therapists were the most encouraging, which meals were worth eating, and how to work the television remote in the community room. The key, Margaret told me during my second week, is to remember that this isn't permanent. Most of us are just passing through on our way back to our real lives. I clung to that phrase, passing through. It suggested movement, progress, a destination that lay somewhere beyond these beige walls and fluorescent lights. I threw myself into my therapy sessions with determination that surprised even me. I practiced walking between parallel bars until my legs ached, repeated tongue twisters until my mouth felt dry, and worked on fine motor skills by picking up tiny objects and placing them in precise patterns. But even as my body grew stronger and my speech clearer, my heart grew heavier with each passing day that Rebecca didn't visit. She called once during my second week, a brief conversation that felt more like a status check than a genuine inquiry about my well-being. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Better," I managed, though the word came out slightly thick. "Therapy is helping." "That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear it. Listen, Emma has a recital this weekend and Jacob has a tournament, so we're going to be pretty busy. But I'll try to stop by next week if I can." Next week came and went without a visit. So did the week after that. When I finally worked up the courage to call Rebecca myself, she sounded distracted and hurried. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but things have just been crazy here. David's been traveling for work, and the kids have so many activities. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. I had never been the kind of mother who was too busy for her child, even when Rebecca was at her most demanding teenage phase. I had always made time, had always prioritized her needs above my own. The realization that this consideration wasn't being returned felt like another stroke, this one attacking my heart instead of my brain. By my fourth week at Sunset Manor, I had stopped expecting visits and started dreading phone calls. Rebecca's voice always carried an undercurrent of obligation, as if speaking to her own mother was another item on her endless to-do list that she couldn't wait to check off. David never got on the phone at all, and the grandchildren I had once delighted in spoiling seemed to have forgotten I existed. It was during my fifth week that I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I was walking slowly down the hallway toward the physical therapy room, concentrating on keeping my gait even and my posture straight, when I heard familiar voices coming from the administrative office. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see Rebecca and David sitting across from Mrs. Patterson, the facility's director. "We want to make sure my mother gets the best possible care," Rebecca was saying. "But we also need to be realistic about the long-term situation." "Of course," Mrs. Patterson replied in her practiced professional tone. "Many families find themselves in similar circumstances. Your mother is making excellent progress, but stroke recovery can be unpredictable. Some patients regain full independence, while others need ongoing support." "That's what we're worried about," David said, leaning forward in his chair. "Rebecca's mother is 71 years old, and that house she's been living in is really too big for someone her age, especially now. We've been thinking it might be better for everyone if she transitioned to a long-term care situation." Long-term care situation. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from stumbling. They weren't talking about my rehabilitation or my recovery or my eventual return home. They were talking about warehousing me permanently, about taking away my independence and my choices and my dignity all in one bureaucratic decision. "Has your mother expressed any preferences about her living situation?" Mrs. Patterson asked, and I found myself holding my breath waiting for Rebecca's answer. "Well, she's always been very attached to that house," Rebecca said, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. "But honestly, I think she's just being sentimental. She doesn't realize how impractical it would be for her to live alone again, especially if she has another stroke. This way, she'll have professional care available 24 hours a day, and David and I won't have to worry constantly about her safety. Won't have to worry. Won't have to be inconvenienced. Won't have to rearrange their perfect suburban lives to accommodate an aging mother who had the audacity to suffer a stroke and need support." I pressed my back against the wall and closed, my eyes feeling something inside me break that had nothing to do with blood clots or damaged brain tissue. "The financial aspects are important too," David added, and his voice had that same tone he used when discussing real estate deals. "The house is worth quite a bit in the current market, and selling it would provide funds for her long-term care while also eliminating the ongoing expenses of maintenance and property taxes." Selling my house, selling the home where I had lived for 37 years, where I had raised my daughter, where I had buried my husband's ashes in the rose garden we had planted together on our 10th wedding anniversary. Selling the place where every room held memories, where every corner contained some piece of the life I had built with careful intention and deep love. I turned and walked away as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid it might trigger another stroke. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the photograph of Rebecca and me at her graduation. In that picture, she was looking at me with genuine affection, her arm tight around my waist, her smile bright with possibility and hope. I tried to reconcile that young woman with the person I had just heard discussing my future like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a mother to be cherished. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the conversation I had overheard. Part of me wanted to confront Rebecca directly, to demand an explanation for why she was making decisions about my life without including me in the discussion. But another part of me was afraid of what her answer might be, afraid that she would confirm what I was beginning to suspect, that I had become nothing more than a burden to her, an inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than a person deserving of love and respect. Over the next few days, I found myself observing the other residents with new eyes. There was Harold, whose son visited faithfully every Sunday, and whose grandchildren sent him hand-drawn pictures that he proudly displayed on his bulletin board. There was Dorothy, whose daughter called every evening, and whose room was filled with flowers and cards from friends and family members. And then there were the others, the ones whose families had gradually faded away, who spent their days sitting in the community room watching television programs they didn't really care about, waiting for visits that never came, and phone calls that grew increasingly rare. I realized with a cold certainty that I was sliding into that second category, that Rebecca's brief calls and broken promises to visit were the beginning of a gradual abandonment that would leave me as isolated as some of the other forgotten residents. The thought terrified me more than the stroke itself had, because at least the stroke had been a medical emergency with clear treatment protocols and measurable progress markers. This was something else entirely, a slow erosion of family bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. It was Margaret who finally forced me to face the reality of my situation. We were sitting in the courtyard during a rare sunny afternoon, watching a group of teenagers from a local church perform songs for the residents. Most of the audience was politely attentive, but I could tell that many of the performers were there reluctantly, fulfilling community service requirements rather than genuinely wanting to brighten anyone's day. "How long have you been here now?" Margaret asked me during a break between songs. 6 weeks, I replied, and was pleased that my speech was clear and steady. "And how many visits have you had?" The question was gentle but pointed, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "My daughter is very busy with her family and her job," I said, the words sounding hollow even to me. Margaret nodded knowingly. "That's what I told myself for the first few months, too. My son lives less than an hour away, and for a while I made excuses for why he couldn't come more often. Work, family obligations, traffic, whatever. It took me a long time to accept that some people just aren't built for this kind of thing. They love us, in their way, but they can't handle seeing us vulnerable or diminished. It's easier for them to love us from a distance." "Rebecca isn't like that," I protested, but my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Margaret said kindly. "But if she is, it's better to know it now so you can start making your own plans. The worst thing you can do is sit around waiting for someone to rescue you when you're perfectly capable of rescuing yourself." That evening, I called Rebecca's house. David answered, which was unusual, and his tone was polite but cool. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Wilson. Rebecca's at Emma's piano lesson, but I can have her call you back." "Actually, David, I wanted to talk to you too. I heard you and Rebecca discussing my situation with Mrs. Patterson last week." There was a pause, and I could practically hear him calculating how to respond. "We're just trying to make sure you get the best possible care, Mrs. Wilson. Rebecca's been really worried about you." "Her worried enough to visit me?" Another pause, longer this time. "I know she feels terrible about not being able to get over there more often. Things have just been really hectic lately." "Too hectic to visit your mother-in-law who's recovering from a stroke?" "Mrs. Wilson, I think you might be misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything, David. I heard you talking about selling my house and putting me in long-term care. I heard you discussing my life like I'm not capable of making my own decisions." His voice became more formal, more distant. "I think this is really a conversation you should have with Rebecca. I'll make sure she calls you tonight." But Rebecca didn't call that night, or the next night, or the night after that. When I finally reached her 3 days later, her voice was strained and defensive. "Mom, David told me you were upset about something. I think there might have been some miscommunication." "There was no miscommunication, Rebecca. I heard you both talking about selling my house and keeping me here permanently. Were you planning to discuss this with me at some point, or were you just going to make the decision and present it as a fait accompli?" "Mom, please don't be dramatic. We're just trying to look out for your best interests. That house is too big for you now, and living alone at your age, especially after a stroke. At my age, I'm 71, not 91, and I'm recovering beautifully, according to every therapist here. There's no medical reason I can't go home. But what if something happens? What if you fall or have another stroke? David and I would never forgive ourselves if what? If you had to be inconvenienced by taking care of your mother? If you had to rearrange your busy social calendar to help the person who spent 25 years putting your needs before her own?" There was a long silence, and when Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way I had never heard before. "That's not fair, Mom. I have my own family to think about now. I can't drop everything to take care of you, especially when there are professionals who can do a much better job. I'm not asking you to drop everything. I'm asking you to include me in decisions about my own life. I'm asking you to remember that I'm still your mother, not just a problem that needs to be solved. Mom, I think you're being unreasonable. Maybe you should talk to someone here about adjusting your medication. Sometimes stroke patients can become paranoid or... I hung up the phone before she could finish the sentence. My hands were shaking, but not from any lingering effects of the stroke. They were shaking with rage and hurt, and the terrible realization that my daughter had just suggested I was mentally incompetent, rather than face the truth about her own behavior. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I had spent 6 weeks being a good patient, following the rules, accepting other people's plans for my life. I had been passive and grateful and accommodating, just as I had been raised to be. But lying there in that narrow bed with the fluorescent light from the hallway seeping under my door, I realized that passivity was a luxury I could no longer afford. If my family had decided I was no longer worth their time and attention, if they were planning to make major decisions about my life without consulting me, then perhaps it was time for me to make some decisions of my own. After all, I was still Carol Ann Wilson, and despite what my daughter and her husband seemed to think, I was still very much in control of my own destiny. The next morning, I asked Mrs. Patterson to recommend a lawyer who specialized in elder law and estate planning. She looked surprised but provided me with several names, and I called the first one on the list from the phone in my room. When the receptionist answered, I spoke clearly and confidently, my voice betraying none of the uncertainty I felt inside. "Hello, this is Carol Wilson. I'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss updating my will and some other legal matters. How soon can you see me?" The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old books, a comforting scent that reminded me of Robert's study back when he was alive and working late into the evening on his architectural projects. James Morrison was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of speaking that made me feel like my concerns were valid, rather than the paranoid delusions of an aging stroke patient. "Mrs. Wilson," he said as he reviewed the documents I had brought with me, "I have to say, your current will is quite straightforward. Everything goes to your daughter Rebecca upon your death, with provisions for your grandchildren if something happens to her. Is there something specific you'd like to change?" I had taken a taxi to his office, my first venture outside Sunset Manor since Rebecca had deposited me there 7 weeks earlier. The physical therapists had cleared me for independent mobility with just a walking stick for balance, and I had felt a surge of pride as I navigated the sidewalks and doorways without assistance. For the first time since my stroke, I felt like myself again rather than a patient or a problem to be managed. "I want to understand all of my options," I said carefully. My daughter and her husband seem to believe that I'm no longer capable of making decisions about my own life. They're planning to sell my house and keep me in long-term care without consulting me. I need to know what rights I have and what steps I can take to protect myself. Mr. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "First, let me be clear about something important. Having a stroke doesn't automatically affect your legal capacity to make decisions. As long as you can understand the nature and consequences of your choices, you have every right to determine how your assets are managed and where you live." The relief I felt was so intense, it was almost physical. For weeks, I had been made to feel like my opinions and preferences were irrelevant, like the stroke had somehow stripped away my autonomy along with my fine motor control. Hearing a legal professional confirm that I still had agency over my own life felt like being given permission to breathe again. "That said," he continued, "family disputes over elder care can become quite complicated, especially when there are significant assets involved. Can you tell me about your financial situation?" I explained about the house, which Robert and I had purchased in 1986 for $85,000, and which was now worth well over $600,000 in the current market. I told him about Robert's life insurance policy, which had been substantial, and about the various investments and savings accounts we had accumulated over our 43 years of marriage. I mentioned the pension I received from my 30 years of teaching high school English and the Social Security benefits that provided a steady monthly income. "Mrs. Wilson," Mr. Morrison said slowly, "you're describing assets worth well over $1 million. Your daughter and son-in-law may be concerned about your care, but they also have significant financial incentives for making decisions about your living situation." The bluntness of his statement hit me like cold water. I had been so focused on the emotional betrayal of Rebecca's abandonment that I hadn't fully considered the financial motivations behind her behavior. But now, sitting in this office with the numbers laid out starkly on paper, I could see the ugly truth. My house, my investments, my carefully accumulated wealth, all of it would belong to Rebecca when I died. And if I were safely tucked away, in long-term care, unable to change my will or make independent decisions, that inheritance would be protected from any inconvenient choices I might make. "What are my options?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Several. You could update your will to reflect your current feelings about how your assets should be distributed. You could establish a trust that would give you more control over how your money is used for your care. You could also look into setting up advance directives that would clearly spell out your preferences for living arrangements and medical care." He paused, studying my face carefully. "Or, if you're feeling particularly concerned about your daughter's motivations, you could make more dramatic changes. Some clients in your situation choose to leave their assets to charities or other beneficiaries, especially if they feel their family members are more interested in their inheritance than in their well-being." The idea was shocking and liberating at the same time. I had spent my entire adult life assuming that everything I owned would naturally pass to Rebecca, that providing for my daughter and grandchildren was my primary responsibility even after death. It had never occurred to me that this assumption might be giving Rebecca power over me, that the promise of inheritance might be influencing her decisions about my care in ways that weren't in my best interest. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course. But Mrs. Wilson, if you do decide to make changes, I'd recommend acting sooner rather than later. If your family does try to challenge your competency, it's better to have legal documents prepared while your recovery is still progressing and your mental acuity is clearly improving." The taxi ride back to Sunset Manor gave me time to process what I had learned. As we drove through the familiar neighborhoods of the city where I had lived my entire adult life, I found myself looking at everything with new eyes. The coffee shop, where Robert and I had shared breakfast every Sunday for 20 years. The bookstore where I had spent countless hours browsing for novels to share with my students. The park where I had pushed Rebecca on swings when she was small, where I had taught her to ride a bicycle, where we had fed ducks together on Saturday mornings. All of those memories felt precious but also distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. The woman who had lived those experiences had been secure in her relationships, confident that love and sacrifice would be rewarded with loyalty and care. She had believed that being a good mother meant putting her child's needs above her own, that selflessness was the highest virtue a woman could possess. But that woman had also been naive. She had assumed that love was reciprocal, that the devotion she poured into her family would be returned when she needed it most. She had never considered that her own daughter might view her as a burden rather than a blessing, that the same independence and competence that had made her a good mother might be seen as obstacles to be overcome, rather than strengths to be celebrated. Back in my room at Sunset Manor, I sat by the window and watched the other residents moving slowly through the courtyard. Some were accompanied by family members, children and grandchildren who chatted easily and pushed wheelchairs. With gentle attention, others sat alone, staring at nothing in particular, their faces wearing the blank expression of people who had stopped expecting anything from life. I didn't want to become one of those solitary figures, but I also couldn't bear the thought of pretending that Rebecca's behavior was acceptable just to maintain the illusion of family harmony. The conversation with Mr. Morrison had shown me that I had options, that I wasn't as powerless as I had been made to feel. But exercising those options would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed. That evening, Margaret knocked on my door and invited me to join her for dinner in the main dining room. Usually I preferred to eat in my room, partly because the communal meals reminded me too sharply of how alone I was, but tonight I felt like I needed company. "You look different," Margaret observed as we found seats at a table near the windows. "More alert, like you've made some kind of decision." "I saw a lawyer today," I said quietly, "about updating my will and protecting my interests." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Good for you. It's about time you stopped waiting for your daughter to remember she has a mother." "I keep thinking I should give her another chance," I admitted. "Maybe she's just overwhelmed with her own responsibilities. Maybe if I'm patient and understanding—" "Carol," Margaret interrupted gently, "how long are you willing to wait? How many excuses are you going to make for someone who hasn't visited? You in 7 weeks? At what point do you accept that her behavior is telling you exactly how she feels about you?" The words stung, but they also rang with truth. I had been so focused on maintaining hope that I had ignored the mounting evidence of Rebecca's indifference. Every missed visit, every brief phone call, every broken promise had been explained away as temporary circumstances rather than permanent choices. "My son visits me twice a month," Margaret continued. "Not because I'm dying or because he feels guilty, but because he genuinely enjoys my company. He brings his kids because he wants them to know their grandmother, not because he's fulfilling some obligation. That's what real family looks like, Carol. Not duty or guilt or manipulation, but choice. Love that chooses to show up." After dinner, I returned to my room and pulled out the photograph of Rebecca and me at her graduation. For 23 years, that image had represented one of the happiest days of my life. A moment when my pride in my daughter's accomplishments had felt like a physical force in my chest. But looking at it now, I noticed things I had missed before. The way Rebecca's smile seemed directed at the camera, rather than at me. The slight stiffness in her posture, as if she was already pulling away even as she posed for the picture. Had there been signs even then that our relationship was more complicated than I wanted to believe? Had I been so invested in being a good mother that I had missed the signs that Rebecca was already beginning to see me as an obstacle to her independence rather than a source of support? I thought about all the sacrifices I had made over the years, all the times I had put Rebecca's needs ahead of my own. When she wanted to attend an expensive private college, Robert and I had taken out a second mortgage on the house to pay for her education. When she had trouble finding a job after graduation, we had supplemented her income for 2 years while she figured out her career path. When she and David wanted to buy their first house, we had provided the down payment as a wedding gift. At the time. Those sacrifices had felt natural and necessary, expressions of parental love that would strengthen the bond between us. But now I wondered if they had actually weakened that bond, if my willingness to give had somehow made Rebecca feel entitled to take. Had I taught her that my role was to provide and support and sacrifice, but never to need or expect or demand anything in return? The thought was painful, but it also carried a strange kind of relief. If my relationship with Rebecca had been built on fundamentally unequal terms, then her current behavior wasn't a betrayal of everything we had shared. It was simply the logical conclusion of a dynamic I had helped create. And if I had played a role in creating that dynamic, then perhaps I also had the power to change it. That night, I called Rebecca's house again. This time she answered, and her voice carried that familiar tone of resigned duty. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling much better, thank you. Strong enough to make some important decisions about my future." "That's wonderful. I'm so glad the therapy is helping." "Rebecca, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Do you have any intention of allowing me to return to my house when my rehabilitation is complete?" There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of a television in the background, the murmur of family life continuing around our conversation. "Mom, we've talked about this. The house is just too big and too isolated. You'd be much safer in a facility where there are people around to help if something happens. What if I hired a home health aide? What if I installed a medical alert system? What if I made modifications to make the house safer?" "Mom, please don't make this harder." "Then it has to be. David and I have looked into all the options, and we really think this is the best solution for everyone." "Best for everyone? Or best for you and David?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know what you mean by that." "I mean that keeping me in long-term care and selling my house would solve a lot of problems for you. You wouldn't have to worry about taking care of me, and you'd have access to the proceeds from the sale immediately instead of waiting for me to die." "Mom!" Rebecca's voice was sharp with shock or outrage. I couldn't tell which. "How can you say something like that? We're trying to do what's best for you, not for us." "Are you? Because I haven't seen any evidence that you're considering what I want. You've made all these plans without consulting me. You've barely visited me since I've been here, and when I try to discuss alternatives, you dismiss my concerns as unreasonable." "You're being paranoid, Mom. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Martinez about adjusting your medication." There it was again. The suggestion that my perfectly rational concerns were symptoms of mental illness rather than legitimate responses to legitimate problems. The implication that any resistance to their plans was evidence of cognitive impairment rather than simple disagreement. "I'm not paranoid, Rebecca. I'm clear-headed for the first time in weeks, and I want you to know that I'm taking steps to protect my interests and ensure that my wishes are respected." "What kind of steps?" "I've consulted with a lawyer about updating my will and establishing legal protections for myself. I wanted to give you the courtesy of knowing about it before I proceed." The silence that followed was so long, I thought the call might have been disconnected. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was cold and controlled. "I think you're making a mistake, Mom. I think you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. But if that's what you want to do, I can't stop you." "No, you can't," I agreed. "That's exactly the point." After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, feeling something shift inside me like the settling of a foundation after an earthquake. For the first time since my stroke, I wasn't waiting for someone else to determine my fate. I wasn't hoping for rescue or approval or permission. I was taking action, making choices, asserting control over my own life. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The next morning, I called Mr. Morrison and scheduled a follow-up appointment. I also called Dr. Martinez and asked for a comprehensive evaluation of my cognitive function and my readiness for independent living. If Rebecca and David wanted to question my competency, I would arm myself with professional documentation that would be difficult to challenge. Over the following days, I threw myself into my rehabilitation with renewed intensity. I worked with Sarah on strengthening exercises that would prepare me for the physical demands of living alone. I practiced cooking simple meals in the facility's kitchen to demonstrate that I could safely manage basic domestic tasks. I worked with Linda on articulation exercises until my speech was completely clear and confident. Most importantly, I began researching options for returning home. I contacted home health agencies, medical equipment companies, and contractors who specialized in accessibility modifications. I gathered quotes and references and created a comprehensive plan for safe, independent living that addressed every concern Rebecca and David had raised. But even as I prepared to fight for my right to go home, part of me grieved for the relationship I had lost with my daughter. The woman who had driven away from Sunset Manor 7 weeks earlier had believed that love was enough. that the bond between a mother and child was unbreakable no matter what challenges arose. That woman had been wrong, but she had also been happier than the woman I was becoming. This new version of myself was stronger and more self-reliant, but she was also lonelier. She had learned that love without respect was worthless, that sacrifice without reciprocity was foolishness, that family bonds could be broken by selfishness and greed as easily as by death or distance. It was a painful education, but it was also necessary, because the alternative, remaining passive and grateful while other people made decisions about my life, was a kind of death in itself, and I wasn't ready to die, not yet. I had too much living left to do, too many choices to make, too many ways to prove that Carol Ann Wilson was far from finished. The revelation about my financial assets and legal options was like discovering I had been carrying a loaded weapon all along without realizing it. But knowledge was only the first step. Now I needed the courage to use that weapon if necessary, to protect myself from the people who were supposed to love me most. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 71 years old, after a stroke that had temporarily robbed me of speech and mobility, I was finally learning how to fight. Better late than never, I supposed. 3 days after my confrontational phone call with Rebecca, she finally came to visit. I was in the physical therapy room working with Sarah when I saw her walk into the facility, and even from a distance I could tell she was angry. Her posture was rigid, her movements sharp and efficient, her expression set in the kind of determined lines that reminded me uncomfortably of her father when he was preparing for a difficult business negotiation. "Your daughter is here," Sarah said gently, noting the direction of my gaze. "Would you like to finish this session later?" "No," I said firmly. "Let's complete the full routine. She can wait." It was a small act of defiance, but it felt significant. The old Carol would have dropped everything the moment Rebecca appeared, would have been grateful for any crumb of attention and eager to accommodate her daughter's schedule. But the new Carol understood that power dynamics were established through small gestures as much as grand ones, and she wasn't going to begin this conversation from a position of weakness. I completed my therapy session with deliberate thoroughness, working through every exercise with careful attention to form and technique. Through the glass partition that separated the therapy room from the main corridor, I could see Rebecca pacing impatiently, checking her phone repeatedly, her irritation growing more visible with each passing minute. When I finally joined her, in the family conference room that Mrs. Patterson had reserved for our meeting, Rebecca's first words confirmed what her body language had already told me. "I can't believe you kept me waiting for 45 minutes just to finish some exercises." "Physical therapy is an essential part of my recovery," I replied calmly, settling into my chair with the walking stick propped beside me. "I take it seriously because I'm committed to regaining my independence." "About that," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the brisk, businesslike tone she used at work. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, and I'm concerned that you're not seeing the situation clearly." "In what way?" "Mom, you had a stroke. A serious stroke that could have killed you. Even though you're recovering well, the fact remains that you're at higher risk for future strokes, falls, and other medical emergencies. Living alone in that big house isn't safe anymore, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise." I had expected this argument, had prepared for it during the long hours I'd spent lying awake planning this conversation. "I've researched home health services extensively," I said, pulling out a folder of documents I had compiled. "I can hire a part-time aide to help with household tasks and provide companionship. I can install medical alert systems, grab bars, ramps, whatever modifications are necessary to make the house safe." Rebecca barely glanced at the papers I offered. "That's not the point, Mom. Even with all those services, you'd still be essentially alone. What happens if you have another stroke and the aide isn't there? What happens if you fall in the middle of the night?" "The same things that could happen to anyone my age, Rebecca. Life involves risks, I could have a stroke or a fall here at Sunset Manor just as easily as I could at home. The difference is that at home, I'd be living my life on my own terms instead of existing according to someone else's schedule and rules. But here you have professional medical staff available 24 hours a day. You have structured activities and social interaction and I'm miserable, I interrupted. I'm grateful for the care I've received here, but this isn't living, Rebecca. This is warehousing. This is parking elderly people in institutional settings so their families don't have to be inconvenienced by their needs. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. That's not fair, Mom. David and I aren't trying to get rid of you. We're trying to make sure you're safe and well cared for. Without consulting me about what I want, without considering that my happiness and autonomy might be more important to me than absolute safety. Happiness? Rebecca's voice rose slightly. Mom, you could die if you're living alone and something happens. How is that supposed to make anyone happy? I could die here too. Rebecca, I could die tomorrow, or next year, or in 10 years. The question isn't whether I'll die, it's whether I'll live first. And I can't live the way I want to live in a place like this. We stared at each other across the small table, and I could see my daughter struggling with concepts that clearly made her uncomfortable. For Rebecca, life was about optimization and risk management, about making rational decisions based on practical considerations. The idea that I might choose potential, danger over guaranteed safety was genuinely incomprehensible to her. Even if we agreed to let you try living at home again, she said finally, the house is too big and too expensive to maintain. The property taxes alone are enormous, and the upkeep costs keep increasing every year. It makes more financial sense to sell while the market is strong and use the proceeds to pay for quality long-term care. There it was, the financial argument laid bare. Not concern for my well-being, but concern for the efficient management of assets that Rebecca already considered her inheritance. Let me ask you something, I said quietly. If I were 20 years younger and perfectly healthy, would you be having this conversation with me? Would you be arguing that I should sell my house and move into institutional care? That's different. You weren't at risk then. Was I not? I was living alone after your father died. I could have had a heart attack or a fall or any number of medical emergencies. But you never suggested that I should give up my independence then. What's really different now? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. You're older now, more vulnerable. I'm 3 years older than I was when your father died, Rebecca. 3 years. What's really different is that now you and David see an opportunity to access my assets while I'm still alive to make the transition convenient for you. Mom, that's a terrible thing to say. We're not trying to steal from you. No? Then why are you so eager to sell my house and manage my money? Why won't you consider alternatives that would allow me to maintain some control over my own life? Because we love you, and we're trying to protect you. The words came out as a shout, and for a moment Rebecca looked startled by her own vehemence. In the silence that followed, I could see her struggling to regain her composure, to return to the rational, business-like tone she had adopted for this conversation. Rebecca, I said gently, if you love me, then trust me to make my own decisions. Help me find ways to live safely at home instead of assuming that I'm incapable of managing my own life. Treat me like a person whose opinions matter instead of a problem that needs to be solved. It's not that simple, Mom. You don't understand all the complexities involved. Then explain them to me. Show me the respect of treating me like an intelligent adult who can understand complex situations if they're explained clearly. But Rebecca was already gathering her purse and jacket, her face set in stubborn lines that reminded me painfully of her teenage years when she would shut down communication rather than engage with ideas that challenged her worldview. I think you're making a mistake, she said stiffly. I think you're letting pride and stubbornness cloud your judgment. But if you're determined to pursue this course of action, I can't stop you. No, I agreed. You can't. That's what legal competency means, Rebecca. It means I get to make my own choices, even if other people think they're wrong. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. I hope you know what you're doing, Mom. I really hope you know what you're doing. After she left, I sat alone, in the conference room for a long time, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. The conversation had confirmed my worst fears about Rebecca's motivations, but it had also clarified my options. She wasn't going to support my desire for independence, wasn't going to help me find ways to live safely at home. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I would have to do it entirely on my own. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant accepting that my relationship with my daughter was fundamentally different from what I had believed it to be. Liberating because it freed me from the need to consider her approval or cooperation in my decision-making process. That evening, I called Mr. Morrison and scheduled an appointment for the following week. It was time to make some changes to my will, changes that would reflect my new understanding of family loyalty and ensure that my assets would be used in ways that honored my values rather than rewarding selfishness. I also began making concrete plans for my return home. Dr. Martinez had agreed to provide medical clearance for independent living as long as I had appropriate support systems in place. I had interviewed 3 home health agencies and chosen the one that seemed most responsive to my specific needs and preferences. I had contacted contractors about installing safety modifications and received estimates for the work. Most importantly, I had stopped waiting for permission to live my own life. Whether Rebecca approved or not, whether she visited or called or acknowledged my existence, I was going home. I was going to reclaim my independence, my autonomy, and my right to make my own choices about how to spend whatever time I had left. The woman who had arrived at Sunset Manor 8 weeks earlier had been broken in body and spirit, dependent on others for the most basic decisions about her care and future. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and more self-reliant, someone who had learned that love without respect was worthless, and that family bonds could be more constraining than liberating. This new Carol Ann Wilson was ready to fight for herself, ready to use every weapon at her disposal to protect her independence and dignity. And her most powerful weapon, she had discovered, was her money. The assets that Rebecca and David were so eager to control could be redirected, could be used to support causes and people who would appreciate them rather than simply expect them. It was time to update her will, time to make some changes that would shock her daughter into understanding that actions have consequences. Time to show Rebecca and David that underestimating Carol Ann Wilson had been a very expensive mistake. The second meeting with Mr. Morrison felt different from the first. I wasn't a confused, frightened woman seeking advice anymore. I was a client with a clear agenda and the resources to implement whatever decisions I chose to make. The transformation in my own confidence was remarkable, even to me. "Mrs. Wilson," he said as I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, "you look much stronger than when I saw you 2 weeks ago. How has your recovery been progressing?" "Excellently," I replied, and I was pleased to hear that my voice carried none of the hesitation or slurred speech that had plagued me in those first weeks after the stroke. "Dr. Martinez has cleared me for independent living, and I've arranged for all the support services I'll need to return home safely." "That's wonderful news. And your family's response to these plans?" "My daughter and son-in-law remain opposed to my returning home. They've made it clear that they believe I should remain in long-term institutional care indefinitely." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "They've also made it clear that they view my house and my other assets as resources that should be liquidated to pay for that care, regardless of my own preferences." Mr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And you'd like to make changes to your estate planning that reflect this situation?" "I'd like to explore my options. I want to understand what steps I can take to ensure that my assets are used according to my wishes, not according to what my daughter and her husband consider most convenient or profitable. Before we discuss specific changes, I need to ask you some questions to establish your mental competency for the record. I know this may seem unnecessary, but given your recent stroke and your family's apparent concerns about your decision-making capacity, it's important that we document your cognitive state clearly. For the next 30 minutes, Mr. Morrison asked me questions about my personal history, my financial situation, my understanding of the legal implications of various estate planning options, and my reasoning for wanting to make changes to my will. I answered each question clearly and thoroughly, demonstrating not only that I understood what I was doing, but that I had thought carefully about the consequences of my choices. "Mrs. Wilson," he said finally, "I'm completely satisfied that you have full legal capacity to make these decisions. Your thinking is clear, your reasoning is sound, and your understanding of the implications is comprehensive. Now, what specific changes would you like to make?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. What I was about to do would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my family relationships, would send a message that couldn't be misunderstood or taken back. But Rebecca and David had made their priorities clear, and it was time for me to make mine equally clear. "I want to remove my daughter as the primary beneficiary of my estate," I said firmly. "I want to establish a charitable foundation that will support causes I care about, and I want to ensure that Rebecca receives only a modest inheritance that acknowledges our relationship without rewarding her current behavior." Mr. Morrison's pen paused over his notepad. "That's a significant change, Mrs. Wilson. Are you certain you want to disinherit your daughter almost entirely?" "I'm not disinheriting her entirely. I want to leave her enough to acknowledge that she's my daughter, but not enough to make my death financially beneficial to her. I'm thinking perhaps $50,000, plus some personal items that have sentimental value." "And the rest of your estate?" "I want to establish the Robert and Carol Wilson Foundation for Family Caregivers. The foundation would provide financial support and resources for people who are caring for aging family members, and for elderly individuals who need assistance maintaining their independence." The irony of the foundation's mission wasn't lost on me. I would be using my assets to support the kind of family caregiving that my own daughter had refused to provide, to help other families navigate the challenges that Rebecca and David had simply decided were too inconvenient to address. The foundation could provide grants for home modifications, home health services, respite care for family caregivers, and emergency assistance for elderly individuals facing unexpected health crises, I continued. It would help people in situations similar to mine, people whose families either can't or won't provide the support they need. Mr. Morrison was taking notes rapidly. "This is a substantial undertaking, Mrs. Wilson. With assets of over $1 million, you'd be creating a significant charitable foundation. Have you considered the administrative complexities involved?" "I have. I'd like the foundation to be managed by a professional trustee, with a board of directors that includes representatives from local aging services organizations. I want to ensure that the money is used effectively and that the foundation continues to operate long after I'm gone." "And what about your house? That's likely your most valuable single asset." "I want to live in it for as long as I'm able. After my death, I'd like it to be sold and the proceeds to go to the foundation. However, I want to include a provision that if Rebecca demonstrates genuine care and support for me during my remaining years, she could inherit the house instead." "How would you define genuine care and support?" "Regular visits, not just dutiful phone calls. Involvement in my medical care and decision-making. Treating me with respect and dignity rather than as an inconvenience. Basically, behaving like a daughter who loves her mother rather than an heir who's waiting for her inheritance." Mr. Morrison looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Wilson, I have to ask, is there any possibility of reconciliation with your daughter? Sometimes family conflicts can be resolved through mediation or counseling." "I'm open to reconciliation, but it would require Rebecca to fundamentally change her approach to our relationship. She would need to acknowledge that she's been treating me badly, and she would need to demonstrate through her actions that she values me as a person, rather than just as a source of future wealth. And if she doesn't change, then she'll receive $50,000 and the knowledge that her behavior cost her over $1 million in inheritance. That seems like a fair consequence for abandoning her mother when she needed support. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details of the new will and the foundation documents. Mr. Morrison explained the legal requirements for charitable foundations, the tax implications of my decisions, and the various ways the documents could be structured to achieve my goals while protecting against potential challenges. One thing you should be aware of, he said as we were finishing up, is that your daughter could potentially challenge this will on the grounds that you were unduly influenced by your anger about her behavior, or that your stroke affected your judgment in ways that aren't immediately apparent. What would happen if she did challenge it? She'd have to prove that you lacked the mental capacity to make these decisions, or that someone coerced you into making changes against your will. Given the medical evaluations you've undergone and the clear documentation we're creating today of your reasoning and mental state, such a challenge would be very difficult to sustain, but not impossible. Nothing in law is impossible, Mrs. Wilson, but your case is strong. You've been evaluated by multiple medical professionals who have confirmed your cognitive capacity. You've clearly articulated your reasons for making these changes. You've demonstrated that you understand the consequences of your decisions. Most importantly, you're not acting impulsively. You're making thoughtful choices based on your daughter's actual behavior over an extended period. I left Mr. Morrison's office feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Exhausted because the process of systematically dismantling my daughter's inheritance had been emotionally draining, a formal acknowledgement that our relationship was broken beyond repair. Exhilarated because I had finally taken concrete action to protect myself and ensure that my values would be honored even after my death. The taxi ride back to Sunset Manor gave me time to process what I had done. In the space of 2 hours, I had effectively disinherited my daughter and redirected my life savings toward causes that mattered to me. Rebecca and David's plans to sell my house and manage my assets had been completely derailed, replaced by arrangements that would give them no control over my money and minimal benefit from my death. It was a radical act of self-determination, but it was also an act of hope. The foundation I was creating would help other families avoid the kind of breakdown that had occurred between Rebecca and me. It would support elderly people who wanted to maintain their independence, and it would provide resources for family members who were genuinely committed to caring for their aging relatives. Back in my room at Sunset Manor, I sat by the window and watched the sun set over the city skyline. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace with my situation. I was no longer a victim waiting for rescue or a burden hoping for tolerance. I was a woman with agency and resources, someone who could shape her own destiny and contribute meaningfully to causes she cared about. The changes to my will wouldn't solve all my problems. Rebecca would probably be furious when she eventually learned about them, and the revelation might damage our relationship even further. But our relationship was already so damaged that I wasn't sure it could be salvaged anyway. At least now I knew that my assets would be used for purposes I believed in rather than simply enriching people who had shown me so little consideration. That evening, I called the home health agency I had selected and confirmed the arrangements for my return home. I contacted the contractor who would be installing safety modifications in my house and scheduled the work to begin the following week. I also called Mrs. Patterson and gave her formal notice that I would be leaving Sunset Manor in 10 days. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Mrs. Wilson?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "Independent living is a big step after what you've been through." "I'm as ready as I'll ever be," I replied. "I've been here for 9 weeks and I've learned everything I can learn in an institutional setting. Now I need to test my recovery in the real world." "What about your family? Are they supportive of this decision? My family will have to adjust to my choices, I said diplomatically. This is my life, and these are my decisions to make. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations and arrangements. I met with Dr. Martinez for a final medical evaluation, which confirmed that my physical and cognitive recovery had progressed to the point where independent living was not only feasible, but advisable. I packed my belongings, which had somehow expanded during my stay at Sunset Manor to include books, artwork, and small gifts from other residents who had become friends. Margaret was particularly sad to see me go. "I'm going to miss our conversations," she said, as we sat together in the courtyard on my last afternoon. "You've been good company for an old lady." "You've been more than good company," I replied. "You've been a teacher. You helped me understand that I didn't have to accept other people's definitions of what my life should look like. What will you do now? Besides enjoying your freedom, I mean." "I'm going to live," I said simply. "I'm going to tend my roses, and read books and volunteer at the library. I'm going to make new friends and maybe travel to some of the places Robert and I always planned to visit. I'm going to prove to myself and everyone else that 71 isn't too old to start over." "And your daughter?" "I hope she'll come around eventually. I hope she'll realize that treating me with respect and kindness is more important than managing my assets efficiently. But if she doesn't, I'll be fine. I've learned that I don't need her approval to live a meaningful life." The morning of my departure, I woke up early and spent a few minutes looking around the room that had been my home for over 2 months. It had been a place of healing and growth, but it had never felt like home. Home was the Victorian house, with the rose garden and the memories of Robert, the place where I had raised my daughter and built a life that mattered. The taxi arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, and I watched through the window as the driver loaded my suitcases into the trunk. Mrs. Patterson and several staff members came out to see me off, and I was touched by their genuine warmth and good wishes. Even some of the other residents had gathered in the lobby to say goodbye, and I realized that I had built more meaningful relationships in 9 weeks at Sunset Manor than I had maintained with my own family in recent years. As the taxi pulled away from the rehabilitation center, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness at leaving people who had shown me genuine kindness. Anxiety about managing on my own after so many weeks of institutional support. But mostly, I felt excitement about reclaiming my independence and proving that I was still capable of living life on my own terms. The drive to my house took 25 minutes, through neighborhoods I had known for decades but that somehow looked different now. The familiar streets and landmarks seemed both unchanged and transformed, as if I was seeing them through new eyes. Perhaps that was because I was a different person than the woman who had collapsed in her rose garden 10 weeks earlier. That woman had been confident in her relationships, but vulnerable in her independence. This woman was the opposite, uncertain about her family connections, but absolutely certain about her ability to take care of herself. When the taxi turned onto my street, I felt my heart skip a beat. There was my house, exactly as I had left. It except for the contractor's truck parked in the driveway, and the evidence of work being done to install the safety modifications I had requested. The roses were blooming magnificently, tended by the lawn service I had hired, and the windows sparkled from a recent cleaning. It looked like home. It looked like the place where Carol Ann Wilson belonged. The taxi driver helped me carry my suitcases to the front door, and I stood for a moment with the key in my hand, savoring the significance of the moment. This was my house, bought with my money, maintained with my effort, filled with my memories. No one could take it away from me or force me to leave it. No one could make decisions about my life without my consent. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and the lavender sachets I kept in the linen closets. Everything was exactly as I had left it, but it felt different somehow. It felt like a place where a strong, independent woman lived, rather than a place where a lonely widow waited for other people to give meaning to her days. The first thing I did was walk through every room, reacquainting myself with my possessions and my space. Robert's study, where his architectural drawings still hung on the walls and his favorite books still lined the shelves. The kitchen, where I had prepared thousands of meals for my family, where Rebecca had done homework at the counter while I cooked dinner. The living room where we had celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where Rebecca had opened her college acceptance letter, where Robert and I had danced on our 40th wedding anniversary. All of those memories were still here, but they no longer defined the space. This wasn't just a museum of my past anymore. It was the foundation for whatever future I chose to create. The contractors finished their work over the next 3 days, installing grab bars in the bathrooms, a ramp at the back door, and a medical alert system that would summon help if I fell or had another medical emergency. The home health aide I had hired, a cheerful woman named Rosa who spoke English with a slight accent that reminded me of some of my former students, began coming for 4 hours each morning to help with household tasks and provide companionship. "Mrs. Wilson," Rosa said on her second day, "you don't really need much help, do you? You're doing very well for someone who just had a stroke." "I'm doing well because I'm determined to do well," I replied. "But it's nice to have someone here just in case, and I enjoy the company." "Your daughter, she doesn't visit?" It was an innocent question, but it highlighted the elephant in the room that I hadn't yet been forced to address. Rebecca didn't know I had left Sunset Manor. I hadn't called to tell her about my discharge, hadn't informed her about my arrangements for home care, hadn't sought her approval or input for any of the decisions I had made. For the first time in my adult life, I was living my life without considering how my choices would affect my daughter or what her reaction might be. It was both liberating and terrifying. "My daughter and I have had some disagreements about my care," I told Rosa diplomatically. "She'll adjust to the situation in her own time." But even as I said it, I wondered whether Rebecca would adjust or whether she would escalate our conflict into something even more damaging than it already was. She had expected to control my living situation and my assets, and I had systematically dismantled all of her plans without giving her any opportunity to object or negotiate. The new will was signed and filed. The foundation was established and funded. I was living independently in my own home with appropriate support services. Rebecca's inheritance had been reduced from over $1 million to $50,000, and her authority over my life had been completely eliminated. When she discovered what I had done, she was going to be furious. The question was whether her fury would drive us even further apart, or whether it might shock her into recognizing how badly she had treated me. I was about to find out. Because despite my newfound independence and self-confidence, I still missed my daughter. I still hoped that somewhere beneath her selfishness and entitlement, the little girl who had once loved me unconditionally might still exist. But I was no longer willing to sacrifice my dignity and autonomy for the chance to find her. If Rebecca wanted a relationship with me, she would have to earn it by treating me with the respect I deserved. And if she chose not to make that effort, I had proven to myself that I could build a meaningful life without her. The choice, for once, was entirely hers to make. I had been home for 6 days when the phone rang at 8:30 on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen with Rosa, learning to make breakfast with one hand while using my walking stick for balance, when the shrill sound cut through our comfortable conversation. The caller ID showed Rebecca's name, and I felt my stomach tighten with anticipation. "Good morning, Rebecca," I answered, my voice deliberately calm. "Mom." Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the underlying tension. "I went to visit you at Sunset Manor yesterday. They told me you checked out almost a week ago. They said you went home." "That's correct." "Why didn't you tell me? I drove all the way out there and they said you'd been discharged. I felt like an idiot." "I'm sorry you made an unnecessary trip. I assumed the facility would have contacted you since you were listed as my emergency contact. It was a deliberate deflection, and we both knew it. I could have called her myself. Should have called her if I wanted to maintain any pretense of normal family communication. But I hadn't wanted to give her another opportunity to argue against my decisions or try to manipulate me into changing my mind. Mom, you can't just make major decisions like this without discussing them with family. Moving home after a stroke is a big step. What if something happens? What if you fall or have another medical emergency? I have a medical alert system, a home health aide, and Dr. Martinez has cleared me for independent living. I'm managing quite well, thank you. But you're all alone in that big house. It's not safe, and it's not practical. We've talked about this. No, Rebecca, you've talked about this. You've made pronouncements about what you think is best for me, but you've never actually asked what I want or what would make me happy. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her struggling to regain control of the conversation. I'm coming. Over, she said finally. We need to discuss this face to face. You're welcome to visit, but my decisions aren't up for discussion. I'm living in my own home because that's what I choose to do, and I'm perfectly capable of making that choice. Mom, please don't be stubborn about this. I'm trying to help you. Then help me by respecting my decisions instead of trying to override them. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I stared at the phone for a moment before setting it back in its cradle. Rosa, who had been pretending not to listen while she organized my medications, looked at me with sympathetic eyes. Your daughter is coming to visit? Yes, and she's not happy about my living arrangements. She's worried about you? She's worried about controlling me, I said, then immediately felt guilty for speaking so harshly about Rebecca to a relative, stranger. I'm sorry. That was unfair. She thinks she knows what's best for me, but she doesn't take into account what I actually want. My mother, she was the same way with my grandmother, Rosa said gently. Always telling her what to do, where to live, how to spend her money. My grandmother, she got so tired of it that she moved in with my aunt instead. Sometimes family thinks love means making decisions for people instead of helping them make their own decisions. The observation was astute and painful because it captured exactly what had gone wrong between Rebecca and me. She did love me, in her way, but her love had become possessive and controlling rather than supportive and respectful. She wanted to manage my life rather than enhance it, to solve my problems rather than help me solve them myself. Rebecca arrived 2 hours later, her silver Mercedes pulling into my driveway with the aggressive efficiency that characterized everything she did. I watched her through the living room window as she sat in the car for a moment, probably steeling herself for what she expected to be a difficult conversation. When she finally got out and walked toward the front door, her posture was rigid with determination. I opened the door before she could knock, greeting her with a polite smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. She looked tired and stressed, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged and her blonde hair less styled than usual. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old maternal concern, the instinct to ask what was wrong and offer comfort. Hello, Rebecca. Please come in. She stepped into the foyer and looked around as if seeing the house for the first time. Her gaze took in the new grab bars that had been installed along the hallway, the medical alert device clipped to my shirt, the walking stick propped against the wall. I could see her cataloging what she probably considered evidence of my inability to live safely alone. You look good, Mom, she said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. Stronger than I expected. I am stronger. The therapy at Sunset Manor was very effective, and being home has been wonderful for my spirits. We moved into the living room, where Rosa was dusting the bookshelves with careful attention to Robert's architectural awards. Rebecca's eyes followed my aide's movements with obvious disapproval. Mom, can we speak privately? Rosa is very discreet, and she's part of my support system now. I'd prefer that she stay. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She settled into the armchair that had been Robert's favorite, a choice that struck me as either thoughtless or deliberately provocative. That chair had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd read his evening newspaper and worked on crossword puzzles. Seeing Rebecca sit in it now felt like another small violation of my autonomy. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," she began, her tone suggesting that she had rehearsed this speech. "I realize that maybe I've been too focused on the practical aspects of your care and not enough on your feelings about the situation. It was a promising start, and I felt a cautious flicker of hope. I appreciate that, Rebecca. But I still think you're making a mistake by living here alone. This house is too big, too isolated, and too full of potential hazards for someone in your condition." The hope flickered and died. "Someone in my condition? You know what I mean. Someone who's had a stroke and is at risk for falls or future medical emergencies. Rebecca, I'm 71 years old and recovering from a stroke, not dying. Of a terminal illness. I'm not someone in my condition, I'm your mother, and I'm perfectly capable of making rational decisions about my own life. But you're not thinking clearly about the risks involved. What happens if you fall in the middle of the night? What happens if you have another stroke while you're alone? The same things that could happen to anyone my age, Rebecca. Life involves risks. I could have a medical emergency while I'm living here, or I could have one while I'm living in a nursing home. The difference is that here, I'm living my life according to my own values and preferences instead of according to institutional schedules and rules. But the cost, Mom. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to maintain this house? The property? Taxes alone are over $8,000 a year, and that's not counting maintenance, utilities, insurance, and all the other expenses. There it was again, the financial argument that seemed to drive so many of Rebecca's concerns. I can afford the expenses, Rebecca. Your father and I were careful with our money, and I have more than enough to cover the costs of living here. For now, maybe. But what about when you need more care? What about when the house needs major repairs? What about when your medical expenses increase? I'll deal with those situations when and if they arise. I'm not going to give up my independence today because of problems that might occur in the future." Rebecca leaned forward in Robert's chair, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when explaining complex financial concepts to her clients. "Mom, I know you're attached to this house, but attachment isn't a practical basis for making major life decisions. David and I have run the numbers, and it makes much more financial sense to sell now while the market is strong and use the proceeds to secure high-quality long-term care. Have you run the numbers on what it would cost to modify this house for my needs and hire whatever level of care I require? Have you researched home health services and accessibility modifications and all the other options that would allow me to stay here?" "We've looked into some of those options, but no, you haven't. You've dismissed those options without seriously investigating them because you've already decided that institutional care is more convenient for everyone involved. That's not fair, Mom. We're trying to do what's best for you. What's best for me is being consulted about decisions that affect my life. What's best for me is having my preferences respected instead of dismissed. What's best for me is being treated like a competent adult rather than a problem that needs to be solved." Rebecca sat back in the chair, her expression shifting from patient to frustrated. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this. We're not your enemies, Mom. We're trying to help you. If you want to help me, then support my decision to live in my own home. Help me make it work instead of trying to convince me it's impossible. It's not that simple. There are practical considerations that you're not taking into account. Such as? Well, for one thing, you shouldn't be living alone. Even with a part-time aide, you're by yourself for most of the day and all night. That's not safe for someone who's had a stroke. I have a medical alert system, Rebecca. If I have an emergency, help will come immediately. But what if you're unconscious? What if you can't press the button? Then the same thing would happen that would happen if I had a stroke in a nursing home while the staff was attending to other patients. Rebecca, you can't eliminate all risk from life. You can only decide which risks are worth taking. And you think the risk of living alone is worth taking? I think the risk of giving up my independence and autonomy is much greater than the risk of living in my own home with appropriate support. We stared at each other across the coffee table that had hosted countless family gatherings, where Rebecca had done homework as a child, and where Robert and I had shared morning coffee for decades. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the unspoken resentments and disappointments that had accumulated over the past months. Finally, Rebecca spoke again, her voice quieter, but no less determined. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you doing this because you're angry with David and me? Are you staying here just to prove a point? The question caught me off guard, partly because it contained a grain of truth that I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. Was I staying? In the house partly out of stubbornness, partly to assert my independence in the face of their attempts to control me. I'm staying here because this is my home, and I love it, I said finally. I'm staying here because I'm not ready to give up my independence. But yes, I'm also staying here because I refuse to let other people make major decisions about my life without my consent, even if those people are my own family. So you admit that you're partly motivated by anger. I'm motivated by self-respect. Rebecca, there's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making potentially dangerous decisions just to spite us. The accusation stung because it reduced my carefully considered choices to petty vindictiveness. Rebecca, I've had medical evaluations that confirm I'm capable of living independently. I've arranged for appropriate support services. I've made modifications to ensure the house is safe. These aren't rash decisions made in anger. They're thoughtful choices made by a competent adult who knows what she wants. But what if you're wrong? What if something happens and you get hurt because you insisted on staying here alone? Then I'll deal with the consequences of my choices, just like every other adult in the world does. Rebecca, I survived the death of my husband, raised a daughter as a single mother for the last 13 years of her childhood, and managed a household and a career for decades. I'm not a helpless old woman who needs other people to make decisions for her. I never said you were helpless, didn't you? Because everything you've said and done since my stroke has suggested that you think I'm incapable of managing my own life. Rebecca's face flushed with frustration. That's not what I think, Mom. I think you're vulnerable right now. And I think you're not seeing the situation clearly. What I see clearly is that you and David have been planning my future without consulting me. What I see clearly is that you're more concerned with managing my assets efficiently than with respecting my autonomy. What I see clearly is that you've decided institutional care is more convenient for you, regardless of what I want. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what you thought was best? When was the last time you considered what would make me happy instead of what would be easiest for you to manage? Rebecca stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden where I had collapsed 10 weeks earlier. The roses were in full bloom now, their colors brilliant in the afternoon sunlight. She stared out at them for a long moment before turning back to face me. Mom, I think there's something you need to know. David and I have been talking to a lawyer about guardianship proceedings. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the color drain from my face. Guardianship proceedings meant that they were trying to have me declared legally incompetent, that they wanted to strip away my right to make my own decisions about my life, my money, my future. You're trying to have me declared mentally incompetent? We're exploring our options for protecting you from making decisions that could endanger your health and safety. Protecting me? Rebecca, you're talking about taking away my legal rights as an adult human being. We're talking about ensuring that someone who cares about you has the authority to make decisions in your best interest when you're not able to see the situation clearly. I stood up slowly, gripping my walking stick for support. Not because I needed it for balance, but because I needed something solid to hold on to in the face of this betrayal. Rebecca, I want you to leave my house. Mom, please don't be dramatic. We can work this out. I want you to leave now. And I want you to know that if you pursue guardianship proceedings against me, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your life. What's that supposed to mean? It means that I'm not the helpless old woman you seem to think I am. It means that I have resources and options that you haven't considered. It means that trying to have me declared incompetent will backfire on you in ways you can't imagine. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you that actions have consequences. You've been treating me like I'm already dead, like my only value is as a source of inheritance for you and David. Well, I'm very much alive, and I'm still capable of making my own choices about how my assets are distributed. The silence that followed was electric with tension. I could see Rebecca processing what I had said, trying to understand what I might mean about my resources and options. But she was too focused on her own agenda to grasp the full implications of my words. Mom, you're upset right now, and I understand that. But please don't do anything rash. Don't make decisions you'll regret later. The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to see your true colors, Rebecca. I regret that I spent decades sacrificing for a daughter who would try to have me declared incompetent the moment my needs became inconvenient for her. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? Explain to me how trying to take away my legal rights is an expression of love and concern. Rebecca gathered her purse and jacket, her movements sharp with anger. I'm trying to protect you from yourself, Mom. I'm trying to make sure you get the care you need instead of being stubborn and prideful about accepting help. I don't need protection from myself, Rebecca. I need protection from family members who think they know better than I do about how I should live my life. She paused at the front door, her hand on the handle. I hope you know what you're doing, Mom. I really hope you know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. The question is whether you do. After she left, I stood in the foyer for several minutes, my heart pounding with adrenaline and fury. Guardianship proceedings. My own daughter was trying to have me declared legally incompetent so she could control my life and my money. The betrayal was so complete, so stunning in its coldness, that I could barely process it. Rosa appeared from the kitchen, her face creased with concern. Mrs. Wilson, are you all right? You look very pale. I'm fine, Rosa, or I will be, but I need to make some phone calls. I called Mr. Morrison first, explaining the conversation I had just had with Rebecca and asking what steps I could take to protect myself from guardianship proceedings. His response was reassuring but sobering. Mrs. Wilson, based on our previous meetings and the medical evaluations you've undergone, any attempt to have you declared incompetent would be very difficult to sustain. However, guardianship proceedings can be expensive and stressful, even when they're unsuccessful. I'd recommend that we document your competency as thoroughly as possible and prepare for the possibility that your daughter might follow through on her threat. What kind of documentation? Additional cognitive evaluations, statements from your doctors confirming your mental acuity, testimony from people who interact with you regularly about your decision-making capacity. We want to create an overwhelming body of evidence that you're fully competent to manage your own affairs. And if she does file guardianship proceedings, then we fight them vigorously, and we also consider whether her actions constitute elder abuse or harassment that would justify a restraining order. After I hung up with Mr. Morrison, I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled a comprehensive cognitive evaluation that would create a clear record of my mental competency. I also called the president of the library board, where I had volunteered for years, asking if she would be willing to provide a statement about my mental acuity and decision-making abilities. But most importantly, I called Mr. Morrison back and asked him to expedite the finalization of my new will and the establishment of the foundation. If Rebecca was going to try to have me declared incompetent, I wanted all of my legal affairs in order before she could interfere with my plans. Mr. Morrison, I want everything signed and filed as quickly as possible. I don't want there to be any question about my mental state when these documents were created. I understand. I can have everything ready for your signature by tomorrow. Afternoon. Perfect. And I want you to prepare a letter that will be delivered to my daughter after the will is filed, informing her of the changes I've made. I want her to understand the consequences of her behavior before she takes any irreversible actions. Mrs. Wilson, are you sure you want to reveal these changes now? Sometimes it's better to let people discover them after death, when they can't interfere with your plans. I'm sure. Rebecca is planning to try to control my life and my assets, and I want her to understand that those assets may not be available to her if she continues on this path. I want to give her one last chance to reconsider her behavior. Very well. I'll prepare the letter along with the will. That evening, I sat in the garden where I had collapsed 10 weeks earlier, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The roses Robert and I had planted decades ago bloomed around me, their fragrance heavy in the warm air. This was where my stroke had happened, where my old life had ended and my new life had begun. The woman who had fallen here had been confident in her family relationships, but passive in her own defense. She had believed that love and sacrifice would be rewarded with loyalty and care. She had trusted that her daughter would always put her mother's well-being ahead of convenience and financial considerations. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and more self-reliant. Someone who understood that love without respect was worthless, and that family bonds could be more constraining than liberating. This new Carol Ann Wilson was ready to fight. For herself, ready to use every weapon at her disposal to protect her independence and dignity. Tomorrow she would sign documents that would shock her daughter into understanding that underestimating her mother had been a very expensive mistake. Rebecca wanted to control her inheritance? Well, she was about to discover that there might not be much inheritance left to control. The stroke of luck that Rebecca would soon discover wasn't luck at all. It was the stroke of a pen across legal documents. The stroke of justice being served to a daughter who had forgotten that her mother was still very much alive and very much in control of her own destiny. The letter arrived at Rebecca's house on a Friday morning, delivered by certified mail with Mr. Morrison's law firm's return address, embossed in elegant script across the corner of the envelope. I had specifically requested that it be sent during a time when she would likely be home, when she would have to sign for it personally, rather than having David intercept it at their mailbox. I knew she had received it because my phone began ringing at 11:15, barely an hour after the postal tracking showed the delivery had been completed. I let it ring 4 times before answering, savoring the knowledge that Rebecca was probably pacing her kitchen floor, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. "Hello, Rebecca. What the hell is this?" Her voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Mom, what have you done?" "I've taken steps to protect my interests, just as I told you I would. You can't be serious about this. You can't actually mean to disinherit me over a disagreement about your living arrangements." "I haven't disinherited you, Rebecca. As the letter explains, you'll receive $50,000 and several pieces of jewelry that belong to your grandmother. That's hardly being disinherited." $50,000? Mom, this house alone is worth over $600,000. You're talking about giving away over $1 million to some charity instead of leaving it to your own daughter. I'm talking about creating a foundation that will help families who actually care about each other. Families where the children don't try to have their parents declared incompetent so they can control their inheritance. There was a long pause, and when Rebecca spoke again, her voice was more controlled but no less angry. This is because I mentioned the guardianship proceedings, isn't it? Mom, that was just one option we were exploring. We never said we were definitely going to pursue it. Rebecca, the fact that you would even consider trying to have me declared incompetent tells me everything I need to know about how you view our relationship. You don't see me as your mother who deserves respect and consideration. You see me as an obstacle to accessing my assets. That's not true, isn't it? Then explain to me why you visited me exactly once since my stroke. Explain why you've made plans to sell my house and put me in permanent institutional care without consulting me. Explain why your first response to my recovery and independence was to threaten legal action against me. I was trying to protect you. No, Rebecca, you were trying to control me. There's a significant difference. I could hear her crying now, soft sobs that might have moved me a few months ago, but that now sounded more like manipulation than genuine grief. Mom, please don't do this. We can work things out. I promise I'll do better. I'll be a better daughter. The letter explains exactly what you need to do if you want to be included in my will again. It's not complicated, Rebecca. You need to treat me with respect and dignity. You need to support my choices instead of trying to override them. You need to behave like a daughter who loves her mother instead of an heir who's impatient for her inheritance. But that foundation, Mom, you can't be serious about that. Those people don't even know you. They don't love you the way I do. The foundation will help families who are dealing with the same challenges we've faced. Families where the adult children are actually willing to support their aging parents instead of warehousing them. It will honor your father's memory and my values in a way that simply enriching you and David never could. Dad would want you to take care of your own family first. Your father would be ashamed of how you've treated me, Rebecca. He would be appalled that you would threaten to have me declared incompetent rather than supporting my desire to live independently. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold silence that stretched between us like a chasm. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, more calculating. Fine. If that's how you want to play this, Mom, then that's how we'll play it. But don't think you can manipulate me with threats about changing your will. David and I have been talking to lawyers too, and we know our rights. What rights would those be, Rebecca? We can challenge this will on the grounds that you're not mentally competent to make these kinds of decisions. We can prove that you're acting irrationally, that you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took my breath away. My own daughter was prepared to drag me through legal proceedings that would publicly question my mental capacity, all to protect an inheritance she had never actually earned. Rebecca, if you try to challenge my will, you'll lose everything. The letter from Mr. Morrison explains the legal protections I've put in place. I have medical evaluations confirming my competency. I have documentation of my reasoning for these changes, and I have witnesses who can testify to my mental acuity. We'll see about that. Yes, we will. And Rebecca, you should know that if you do file any legal challenges against me, the provision allowing you to inherit the house by demonstrating genuine care and support will be permanently voided. You'll be left with exactly what your behavior has earned you, $50,000 and the knowledge that your greed cost you over $1 million. She hung up without another word, and I sat holding the phone for several minutes, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because the conversation had confirmed that my relationship with my daughter was damaged beyond repair, that the little girl I had loved and nurtured had grown into a woman I barely recognized. Relief because I had finally stopped pretending that Rebecca's behavior was acceptable, that I owed her unconditional financial support, regardless of how she treated me. Over the next few days, I threw myself into establishing the foundation and preparing for whatever legal challenges Rebecca might mount. I met with the board members I had selected to oversee the foundation's operations, including Dr. Martinez, who had agreed to serve as the medical advisor, and Mrs. Henderson from the library board, who would handle the educational outreach programs. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Martinez said during our first board meeting, "I have to tell you how impressed I am with this initiative. The need for support services for aging individuals and their families is enormous, and this foundation could make a real difference in people's lives." "That's exactly what I'm hoping for," I replied. "I want the foundation to help families avoid the kind of breakdown that occurred between my daughter and me. I want to support people who are genuinely committed to caring for their aging relatives. And I want to provide resources for elderly individuals who need assistance maintaining their independence." The Foundation's first major initiative would be a grant program for home modifications and accessibility improvements, helping elderly individuals make their homes safer without forcing them to give up their independence. We also planned to offer respite care services for family caregivers and emergency assistance funds for people facing unexpected health crises. "It's wonderful work," Mrs. Henderson observed, "and it will create a lasting legacy that reflects your values much better than simply passing wealth to family members who don't appreciate it." Meanwhile, I continued to thrive in my own home with Rosa's assistance. My physical recovery progressed steadily, and my speech was now completely clear and confident. I had started volunteering at the library again, helping with the literacy program for adult learners, and I had joined a book club that met monthly at the community center. For the first time in years, I was building friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligations. The women in my book club were intelligent and engaging, and several of them were dealing with their own challenges related to aging, parents, or difficult adult children. Our discussions often moved beyond literature to more personal topics, and I found myself offering advice based on my recent experiences with asserting independence and setting boundaries. "Carol, you've really inspired me," said Helen, whose son had been pressuring her to sell her condo and move into assisted living. "Hearing about how you stood up to your daughter has given me the courage to tell my son that I'm not ready to give up my independence just because he thinks it would be more convenient. The key," I told her, "is remembering that your life belongs to you, not to your adult children. They can offer advice and support, but they can't make your decisions for you unless you let them." 3 weeks after I had sent the letter to Rebecca, Mr. Morrison called with news that I had been both expecting and dreading. "Mrs. Wilson, I've received papers indicating that your daughter has filed for guardianship proceedings against you. She's claiming that you're mentally incompetent due to the effects of your stroke, and that you need a legal guardian to protect you from making decisions that could endanger your health and financial security." How strong is her case? Frankly, it's very weak. The medical evaluations we've compiled clearly demonstrate your mental competency, and your recent activities show that you're functioning independently and making rational decisions about your life. However, these proceedings can be stressful and expensive even when they're frivolous. What do we need to do? We'll file a comprehensive response that includes all of your medical evaluations, statements from people who interact with you regularly, and documentation of your independent living arrangements. We'll also request that the court require your daughter to pay your legal fees if her petition is dismissed, which should discourage her from pursuing this further. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving me time to prepare my defense and gather additional evidence of my competency. I asked Rosa to provide a statement about my daily functioning, got letters of support from my doctor, my book club friends, and the library volunteers I worked with, and underwent another comprehensive cognitive evaluation that confirmed my mental acuity was completely normal for someone my age. Most importantly, I prepared an impact statement that I planned to read in court, explaining how Rebecca's behavior had affected me and why her petition was motivated by financial considerations, rather than genuine concern for my well-being. The night before the hearing, I sat in Robert's study surrounded by the documents that would determine whether I retained control over my own life. Medical reports, financial statements, legal briefs, character references, the paper trail of A competent adult defending her right to make her own decisions against the challenge of her own daughter. I thought about the woman I had been before my stroke, the woman who had defined herself primarily through her relationships with other people, who had believed that being a good mother meant always putting her child's needs before her own. That woman would have been devastated by the prospect of a public legal battle with her daughter, would have probably capitulated to Rebecca's demands rather than face the humiliation of having her competency questioned in court. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The stroke had taken away my speech and mobility temporarily, but it had given me something more valuable in return: the clarity to see my relationships as they really were rather than as I wished them to be. Rebecca's behavior over the past months had shown me that she valued my money more than my autonomy, that she was willing to destroy our relationship rather than respect my choices. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the bench where Judge Patricia Hernandez would decide my fate. I arrived early with Mr. Morrison, dressed in my best navy suit and carrying a folder of documents that represented my life's work and my fundamental right to self-determination. Rebecca and David were already there with their lawyer, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit who had probably assured them that guardianship proceedings were routine matters that could be resolved quickly and efficiently. Rebecca avoided making eye contact with me, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way she clutched her purse like a shield against the possibility that her plan might fail. When Judge Hernandez called the case, Rebecca's lawyer presented their petition with the confident authority of someone who believed he was doing noble work protecting a vulnerable elderly woman from her own poor judgment. He described my stroke, my age, my decision to live alone against medical advice, and what he characterized as my recent erratic behavior regarding my estate planning. "Your Honor," he concluded, "Mrs. Wilson's family is deeply concerned about her safety and her ability to make rational decisions about her care and her finances. They're not seeking guardianship out of any desire to control her assets, but out of genuine love and concern for her well-being." Then it was Mr. Morrison's turn to present our case, and I watched the judge's expression change as he methodically dismantled every argument Rebecca's lawyer had made. He presented medical evaluations showing that my cognitive function was completely normal, statements from people who interacted with me regularly confirming my mental acuity, and documentation of the careful planning I had done for my independent living arrangements. "Your Honor," Mr. Morrison said, "Mrs. Wilson is not a confused elderly woman making irrational decisions. She's a competent adult who has disagreed with her family about her living arrangements and her estate planning. The fact that her daughter doesn't approve of her choices doesn't make those choices incompetent." When Judge Hernandez asked if I wanted to address the court, I stood up slowly, using my walking stick for support, and delivered the statement I had prepared. "Your Honor, 3 months ago I had a stroke that temporarily affected my speech and mobility, but it didn't affect my mind, my values, or my right to make decisions about my own life. My daughter seems to believe that having a stroke means I'm no longer capable of independent thought, but every medical professional who has evaluated me has confirmed that my cognitive function is completely normal. The real issue here isn't my competency. It's my daughter's desire to control my assets and my living arrangements. She wants me in institutional care not because it's what's best for me, but because it's what's most convenient for her. She wants to manage my money not because I'm incapable of doing so, but because she's already decided how that money should be spent. I understand that my decision to revise my will has upset my daughter, but that decision was made for good. Reasons based on her behavior toward me over the past several months. I'm not asking this court to approve of my estate planning choices, only to confirm that I have the right to make those choices myself. I've spent my entire adult life putting other people's needs before my own, and I'm not willing to do that anymore. I'm 71 years old. I've survived the death of my husband and a serious stroke, and I've proven that I can live independently with appropriate support. I'm asking this court to confirm that I have the same rights as any other competent adult, to make my own decisions about my life, even if my family doesn't approve of those decisions. Judge Hernandez deliberated for less than 15 minutes before returning to announce her decision. After reviewing all the evidence presented, I find no basis for the petitioner's claim that Mrs. Wilson lacks the mental capacity to make decisions about her own care and finances. The medical evaluations clearly demonstrate that she is cognitively competent, and her living arrangements show careful planning rather than impaired judgment. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the timing of this petition, which seems to have been filed in response to Mrs. Wilson's estate planning decisions, rather than out of genuine concern for her well-being. The court will not be used as a tool to override competent adults' choices simply because family members disagree with those choices. The petition for guardianship is denied, and I'm ordering the petitioner to pay Mrs. Wilson's legal fees as compensation for this frivolous proceeding. The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, final and absolute. I had won. My right to control my own life had been confirmed by the legal system, and Rebecca's attempt to strip away my autonomy had not only failed, but had cost her money and public humiliation. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Rebecca finally looked at me directly for the first time since the hearing began. Her face was pale and drawn, and I could see that she was struggling not to cry. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct, the desire to comfort her and tell her everything would be all right. But everything wasn't all right. And it wouldn't be until Rebecca fundamentally changed her approach to our relationship. She had chosen to treat me as an adversary rather than as her mother, and she would have to live with the consequences of that choice. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Morrison congratulated me on the outcome and assured me that Rebecca was unlikely to attempt any further legal challenges. She's been publicly rebuked by the court and ordered to pay your legal fees, he said. Most people would consider that a strong signal to change course. Most people aren't as stubborn as my daughter, I replied. But at least now she understands that I'm serious about protecting myself. That evening, I sat in my rose garden watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The flowers were entering their second bloom of the season, more beautiful than ever, their roots deep and strong after surviving the harsh weather of early spring. Like the roses, I had been tested by circumstances beyond my control, had bent but not broken under pressure that might have destroyed someone less resilient. The stroke had knocked me down, but it hadn't defeated me. Rebecca's betrayal had wounded me, but it hadn't destroyed my capacity for hope and growth. I was still Carol Ann Wilson, still the woman who had raised a daughter and built a marriage and created a home filled with love and beauty. But I was also someone new, someone who had learned that self-respect was more valuable than family harmony, that setting boundaries was more important than keeping peace, that standing up for yourself was more loving than enabling other people's bad behavior. The foundation I had created would help other families navigate the challenges of aging and caregiving with more grace and wisdom than Rebecca and I had managed. The money that might have simply enriched my daughter and her husband would instead support people who were genuinely committed to caring for their aging relatives, who understood that love meant respecting people's choices rather than overriding them. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for my relationship with Rebecca, but it was an ending I could live with. I had chosen dignity over dependency, self-respect over family approval, and the future over the past. Whatever time I had left would be spent on my own terms, in my own home, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The stroke of luck that had changed everything wasn't luck at all. It was the courage to recognize my own worth and fight for my right to be treated with respect. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the consequences of their own choices. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable their worst impulses. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I had survived everything that had been thrown at me, and I was still standing, still growing, still blooming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't. Want to pass these up? Just click and check them out.